A Chinese internet troll who had a little too much to drink turned his back on the Communist Party. He slammed Beijing in a YouTube video, despite his reputation as an enthusiastic defender of the communist regime. The U.S. and China hold their first high-level meeting since Biden took office. And a former China policy advisor is raising a new point on what decides U.S. China relations. For the first time in 30 years, the EU is sanctioning communist China. It comes in response to the regime's human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And the Chinese regime often uses business and trade to leverage political gain. We look at what ancient Chinese politicians and culture would have to say about the tactics. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A Chinese internet troll who had a little too much to drink turned into a Communist Party critic, at least for a while. He slammed the party online, despite his reputation as a member of Beijing's so-called 50-cent army, a group paid to defend the communist regime. NTD's Grace Wang has more.
Zheng Guocheng is suspected by many Chinese netizens to be a Wu Mao, or a member of the communist regime's 50-cent army. These are Chinese internet users hired to post on social media, promoting and defending the Chinese Communist Party's or CCP's policies and action. They are paid at least 50 cents for every post, hence the name. But Zheng has never been confirmed to work for the Communist Party, and instead makes a living through social media due to his large fan base. As a result, he's also been referred to as a Wu Mao volunteer. Zheng has loudly attacked the U.S., Taiwan, and Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. He uses Chinese social media platforms as well as YouTube. The video platform is banned in China, and breaking through Beijing's internet blockade is a crime. But Zheng avoids punishment by praising the regime. But without warning, things took a turn last week. That's when he uploaded a 4-hour video fiercely attacking the communist regime. In the video, and under the apparent effects of too much alcohol, he slammed corrupt officials in his hometown, Antu County of Jilin Province. He said the land in his village was meant to be distributed to villagers according to official instructions, but the village officials never gave the land to villagers.
The land in our village, more than 10 years ago, the land should have been distributed to villagers. But up till today, it didn't happen. Why? Are they joking?
He also pointed out the contradiction in what officials say and do related to the U.S.
If we think that the U.S. is bad, then we should investigate from central authorities down to the local level whose children study in the U.S. Then they are the public enemy of the people. When I left my village, they told me that the U.S. is bound to perish, and we shouldn't go to the U.S. But I've seen many things now. How come the children of high-ranking officials have all gone to the U.S.? Are they the enemy of the people? Aren't they?
Zheng also touched on China's petition system. It's a way for Chinese citizens to bring their complaints to higher officials and seek justice for wrongdoing committed against them. But a number of them have been told off or even arrested for doing so. Zheng says the officials in charge of it have done nothing meaningful and called it ridiculous to accuse those who issue petitions of violating the law.
If I issued a petition to officials, my nephew would not be able to pass the civil service exam. The question is, does the petition system make sense? If not, then just cancel it, okay? Since the system exists, why do you punish petitioners' family members? Why?
In some of his most revealing comments, he explained that he pretends to be a young Chinese patriot just to make a living. He disclosed that just last month he made $7,000 from his YouTube videos. Shortly after the video was posted on the same day, he deleted the video. He also apologized in a statement, saying that some of his extreme remarks affected his fans. But netizens don't seem to believe his apparent attempt at damage control. One of them commented he finally told the truth. Another said he told the truth after getting drunk. Brother, don't hold back anymore. All of Zheng's accounts on Chinese social media have since been shut down. Only his YouTube channel is still available. Reporting by Grace Wang, NTD News.
A murder over a soft drink and an argument. A man in China crashed his car repeatedly into his passenger until he killed a man. An analyst says this may be a telling sign of today's Chinese society. NTD's Don Ma has the details.
In China, a man commits murder in public over a bottle of green tea. The killer was a driver for a Chinese ride-hailing service in the southern province of Fujian. He killed a passenger by repeatedly driving his car into him. It all started with a verbal spat between the two. It ended with the passenger throwing a bottle of green tea onto the car. In a fit and full view of the public, the driver accelerated his car into the man against the wall, and then he repeatedly crushed the car into him, killing him. The incident happened last Sunday. The victim's girlfriend was also at the scene. She recounted a horrific sight, saying that she has never seen such a terrifying picture. The driver is now arrested. In China, these kind of crimes have happened time and again. Is this an isolated case, or perhaps it's a product of China's communist society? China affairs analyst Qin Peng believes the driver's actions have to do with the nature of the Chinese society.
People are in a state where they frequently clash with each other. When conflicts can't be resolved, it will often escalate. In the end, it's very possible that it will lead to a physical fight, often resulting in injury or death.
He says that these kind of cases are common in China. Last November, a similar case came about. A man killed his wife with a rock over a quarrel in broad daylight and full view of the public. Something similar happened in 2018. A bus driver deliberately drove his bus off a bridge over a spat with a passenger. It killed nearly everyone on board. But Qin says Chinese society wasn't always like this. He says the CCP has been indoctrinating Chinese people with a culture of struggle ever since it seized power. A prominent example of this is the Tiananmen Square massacre, the crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in 1989.
In China, because the CCP wants to maintain authority, it destroyed normal ideologies and injected its own ideologies. For example, the struggle culture. Mao Zedong said that fighting with heaven brings endless joy, fighting with the earth brings endless joy, and fighting with people brings endless joy. This is the essence of the CCP's struggle culture.
Struggle culture is the main theme of the CCP's past political campaigns. The Communist Manifesto says, quote, "The history of all hetero existing society is the history of class struggles." During the land reform movement in the 1950s, the CCP told people, quote, "Every village bleeds, every household fights." The movement forcibly redistributed land from landowners to peasants. During the Cultural Revolution, beating a person to death was a common event. It's estimated that 70 to 80 million Chinese people died as a result of the CCP's campaigns. Many of the CCP's past campaigns were driven by the principle of struggle. Qin points out that this has negative impacts on Chinese people's behavior in even today's society. Don Ma, NTD News.
The U.S. and China are scheduled to meet in Alaska today. This will be the first time high-level officials from the two countries will meet in person during the Biden administration. NTD's Kevin Hogan has more on what we expect from the meeting.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to meet with top Chinese officials in Anchorage, Alaska on Thursday and Friday. The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will join him. They will meet with China's State Counselor Wang Yi and the country's top diplomat Yang Jiechi. Blinken said the meeting is important for the U.S. to lay out in blunt terms concerns it has with Beijing's actions. It's likely Blinken will bring up the human rights abuses China has committed against Uyghurs in Xinjiang that have been said to breach every article of the U.S. Convention Against Genocide, to ask for U.S. authorities to be allowed to go to Xinjiang if China supposedly has nothing to hide, to see if the two countries can work together on health and climate, to talk about human rights and democratic values in Hong Kong and Tibet. Other issues that may be raised include China's military aggression in the Taiwan Strait and Indo-Pacific. But China's requests have little overlap with those from the U.S. China's issues potentially include lifting the sanctions Trump put on Chinese officials, reestablishing regular meetings between the two countries, undoing restrictions on Huawei and the Chinese-based semiconductor maker, asking the U.S. to drop Trump's restrictions on Chinese officials and reporters. A senior Biden administration official watered down expectations for the Alaska meeting. He doesn't think it's going to lead to any agreement, and it probably won't open the door for more dialogue. And according to a former Obama official who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, for China, it's more of a way for the Chinese to feel out where Americans' heads are and see where the relationship will go. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
The meeting in Alaska is getting a lot of attention from former officials. A former China policy advisor is raising a new point on what decides U.S. China relations. NTD's Juliet Song has more on that.
With tensions rising between China and the U.S., a former Washington China policy advisor is raising a new perspective on what drives relations between the two countries.
A common misunderstanding is that each U.S. administration's China policy decides how the relations between the two countries would go. This isn't right. The most important factor that determines the relations is how the Chinese regime behaves.
Miles Yu was the principal China policy advisor to former State Secretary Mike Pompeo. In an interview with news outlet Radio Free Asia, Yu says regardless of what the U.S. policy towards China is like, the Chinese regime will always see America as its biggest rival.
Even if the U.S. government does nothing, Beijing would still think of America as its biggest enemy. Why? Because the Chinese people are very attracted to America's political system and its political ideology. This is what the Chinese Communist Party fears the most. It is very afraid of Chinese citizens looking up to the American model.
He went on to say that it's the Chinese regime itself, not U.S. policies towards China, that caused some of the lowest points in U.S.-China relations the past few decades.
For example, one of the lowest points was the Tiananmen Square massacre. When this happened, George H.W. Bush was the president. He was very friendly towards China.
Bush went to visit China 1 month after he was inaugurated. Months later, the Chinese Communist Party sent tanks into Tiananmen Square. Soldiers fired shots at unarmed student protesters who gathered to ask for democracy. The massacre shocked the West. The U.S. imposed tough sanctions on the Chinese regime afterwards. Yu says based on past examples, America's China policy should focus on Beijing's behavior.
In terms of U.S.-China relations, we put the primary focus on the Chinese regime's behavior. We adjusted our China policy based on the Chinese government's behavior, intention, and capabilities.
Yu also warns about the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions.
The Chinese political system is a system that upholds the party's leadership and socialism. It would expand across the globe. It's the Chinese Communist Party's long-term plan.
He says America should focus its strategy on preventing Chinese communism from dominating the globe. Juliet Son, NTD News.
Beijing seems to be upping its hostage diplomacy game right before the Alaska meeting, this time by targeting U.S. ally Canada. Before the talk started, Beijing announced that 2 Canadian citizens will face trials in China as soon as this Friday. Former Canadian diplomat Michael Spavor and Canadian businessman Michael Kovrig have been detained in China since December of 2018. The CCP arrested them in an apparent retaliation against Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Meng is the chief financial officer of Chinese tech giant Huawei and also the CEO's daughter. Canada arrested Meng at the request of the United States. The U.S. alleges Meng violated U.S. sanctions on Iran and wants to extradite her. She is currently fighting extradition in a court in Canada. Before Beijing's latest move, the U.S. has also been busy setting the tone for the talk. Right before the Alaska meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Japan and South Korea. The mission is to boost alliance in Asia and counter influence from Communist China. Also on Wednesday, Blinken slapped new sanctions on 24 Chinese Communist officials. He says it's in response to Beijing's latest move to undermine Hong Kong's democracy. Blinken's meeting with Chinese diplomats will last 2 days. For the first time in 30 years, the EU is putting new sanctions against Communist China. This is in response to the regime's human rights abuses. Countries' ambassadors to the EU agreed to ban 4 Chinese officials from entering the EU and to freeze their assets. A Chinese entity is also sanctioned, but their names are not yet public. EU foreign ministers will have to formally approve it on Monday. The move signifies a hardening stance on the communist regime. It's the EU's first sanctions against Beijing since the arms embargo following the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Communist China's envoy to the EU responded, saying that Beijing will not change its policies in face of the sanctions. The sanctioned officials are accused of human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim minority. UN experts say at least 1 million Uyghurs are being detained in camps inside communist China. Victims report systematic torture, forced labor, and forced sterilizations. Some countries, including the U.S. and Canada, have labeled the abuses as genocide. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has been known to use business and trade as leverage for political gain. But what would ancient Chinese politicians and culture have to say about it? In this special report, we explore the role and culture of business in Chinese tradition. We start with ancient Chinese beliefs about free market and how the government's relationship with merchants and businesses was structured. Thousands of years ago, far before capitalism first appeared in Europe, economic thought similar to the free market economy structure appeared in China. Chinese-American historian Yu Yingxi mentioned one example of it in his essay, Business Culture and Chinese Traditions. Around the 6th century BC, a wise statesman named Ji refused to use state power to intervene in market affairs. The request to step in came from another state's chief minister. That minister wanted to force a merchant to sell him a jade ring. But Ji declined and said there's a covenant between the government and the merchants in the country. That is, if you do not revolt against me, I will not violently interfere with your business. I will not beg for or take anything from you, and you may keep your profitable markets, precious things, and substance without my taking any knowledge of them. Based on that principle, even though Ji sought to build good relations with the other state and its minister, he couldn't violate his covenant with the merchants in his country. The mainstream ideology present during China's imperial age also supports free trade and low taxes. The second sage of Confucianism, Mencius, once said if people cannot trade freely, they'll be left with surplus of some goods, yet won't be able to satisfy their need for other goods. He also strongly argued against custom and market duties. Mencius said if a king can enforce regulations without levying high rent and taxes, then all the traders of the kingdom will be pleased and wish to store their goods in his marketplace. And that if at his frontier passes people are inspected, but no taxes are charged on goods or other articles, then all the travelers in the kingdom will be pleased and wish to make their rounds on his roads. Confucianism believes that state interference in the market should be kept to a minimum, and that a state's wealth should be kept with the people instead of with the state. One of the famous disciples of Confucius, Zigong, was a wealthy merchant. He was well respected by state officials, and his efforts helped Confucius's fame spread across China. In his book, Records of the Grand Historian, Chinese historian Sima Qian argued that business development wasn't achieved through government actions, but through following the course of nature. In particular, the book stresses business ethics. In one chapter, called The Biographies of the Moneymakers, it separates rich merchants into categories. The upper level is made of strategists and politicians who were good at managing the country's money in order to make an entire country rich and strong, or the so-called gentleman who is rich and virtuous. At the middle level are those who became rich by seizing opportune timing and who accumulated their wealth through diligent and clever business activities. The lowest level contains the unscrupulous rich, referring to those engaged in lowly or even illegal activity to get money. One story in the book details the life of Bai Gui from the 6th century BC. Bai is acknowledged as the father of business in China. He put forward a business concept, explained as, quote, what others throw away, I take. What others take, I give away. Similar to the idea of buy low and sell high today. He argued that business management is like ruling a country or deploying troops, which requires wisdom, courage, benevolence, and strength. Saying if a man does not have wisdom enough to change with the times, courage enough to make decisions, benevolence enough to know how to give and take, and strength enough to stand his ground, though he may wish to learn my methods, I will never teach him. Bai was known to be frugal and disciplined, often shunning the luxury lifestyle and working alongside his employees instead. Similar stories exist about another famous merchant in ancient China, Fan Li. He made vast fortunes 3 times in 19 years, but each time he gave them away to the needy and then started from scratch. That's because he believed that wealth should be in constant flux, like how water constantly cycles between the land and the sea. He once helped a king rebuild his nation, but immediately left the country after his success. He was even selected as the prime minister of a kingdom, but resigned after a short time serving. Fan wasn't attached to personal wealth or fame, thanks to his understanding of an ancient Chinese text, the Book of Changes. Fan once said, obtaining great wealth, serving as prime minister, these are the highest achievements for a common man like me. It will bring bad luck if I keep them for too long. He also said there is prosperity and decline in one's life. Once the good fortune goes to an extreme, the course must turn toward the opposite direction. Ancient Chinese merchants also stressed maintaining trust with their employees. In the 17th century, a merchant named Xi Benzhen developed a business network, complete with many warehouses all across China. He never visited any of the branches, but his written instructions were nonetheless faithfully carried out by his staff. Some Chinese dynasties implemented policies that discriminated against merchants, like banning them from wearing certain clothes. Those rules caused merchants to be looked down upon in certain time periods. But 16th century Confucianism scholar Wang Yangming argued against them. He said in ancient times, people from different walks of life all followed the same way or ethical code. It was only when people lost their original principles and started craving personal gain, vying to surpass one another, that they began to think highly of scholars and officials and look down on merchants. But another kind of business principle also emerged in China, suggesting policies completely opposite to Confucianism. It was called the legalist school of thought. The legalists believe weakening the people is key to building a strong state. The most famous legalist, Xinjiang, once said, if the people are weak, they honor office. If they are poor, they will prize rewards given by the state. But if they are rich, they will think lightly of state-given rewards and weaken the state's power. Legalist Han Fei once proposed that a wise ruler should decrease the number of merchants in the country and make sure the rest of society looks down on them. The legalist school of thought is a favorite of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP launched a political campaign in the 1970s to promote the legalists and condemn Confucianism, using state newspapers to circulate propaganda articles. CCP leader Mao Zedong once said, the successful and accomplished politicians of all generations were all legalists, while Confucianism always talked about benevolence and morality, advocating for learning from the past and focusing less on the present. They are driving backwards in history. Current Communist leader Xi Jinping has often quoted legalists to comment on state affairs. Apple has reportedly cut ties with its Chinese supplier O-Film Group. The component supplier is accused of helping the CCP transfer ethnic minorities out of China's Xinjiang region to work elsewhere. BBC reported that the CCP's transfer of minorities is for the purpose of, quote, thinning out of their population. It's by transferring hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang far from their homes. An insider told Bloomberg that Apple is believed to have ended its contracts with O-Film over these concerns a few months ago. According to reports, O-Film stocks tumbled by 10%, and it closed at the lowest level since August of 2019. Chinese tech giants are reportedly trying to bypass Apple's upcoming privacy rule. The aim is to continue tracking users without their consent. In the coming weeks, Apple is expected to update its iPhones. The company says this will give users more privacy. Companies and app developers will soon have to ask users for permission before they can gather online tracking data. This data is used to serve users targeted ads. In response, the regime-backed China Advertising Association launched a tool that evades the privacy measures. Chinese tech giants like WeChat's developer Tencent and TikTok's developer ByteDance, among others, are already testing the tool. That way, they can continue tracking online activity without users' consent. That's because most users are expected to not give permission to online tracking. According to the Financial Times, the new privacy rules are expected to deal a multi-billion-dollar blow to the online advertising industry. That includes China's advertising market. Apple released a statement saying, quote, we believe strongly that users should be asked for their permission before being tracked. The App Store terms and guidelines apply equally to all developers around the world. The Financial Times did not say whether non-Chinese app developers are looking to bypass the security measures. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.